They called me too frail for their European vacation while I was literally boarding my private jet to my villa in Switzerland. For 37 years, I'd been the family ATM, funding their dreams while they treated me like a fragile ornament collecting dust. But when they finally pushed me aside, claiming I was too weak for their adventure, I discovered something they never saw coming. I wasn't fragile. I was just getting started. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Hilda Johnson, and at 71 years old, I've learned that sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the ones who see you the least. For decades, I was the invisible foundation holding up a family that never bothered to notice I was crumbling beneath their weight. I paid for college tuitions, wedding expenses, down payments on houses, and countless emergencies that always seemed to arise just when I thought I might finally have something for myself. My daughter Rebecca is 43 and works in marketing, though she changes jobs every 18 months like clockwork. She's married to Derek, a man who fancies himself an entrepreneur but whose business ventures always seem to require my financial intervention. They have 2 teenagers, Madison and Kyle, who've been raised to believe that Grandma Hilda exists solely to write checks and provide free babysitting. My son Marcus is 39, recently divorced, and convinced that his failed marriage was entirely his ex-wife's fault, never mind the gambling problem that drained their savings account. He moved back into my guest house 2 years ago, claiming it was temporary while he got back on his feet. Then there's my youngest, Patricia, 35, and still discovering herself through various artistic phases. She's been a photographer, a jewelry designer, a life coach, and most recently, a spiritual wellness consultant. Each new venture requires startup capital, and somehow, that capital always comes from me. She lives in the converted garage apartment I had built specifically for her, rent-free, while she pursues her latest passion project. I live in Malibu, in a house I bought 40 years ago, when the neighborhood was still affordable, and before it became a celebrity playground. The property has appreciated beyond my wildest dreams, sitting on 3 acres with an ocean view that takes your breath away. But none of my children see the beauty anymore. They see dollar signs and inheritance potential, constantly suggesting I downsize or sell, always with their own financial interests poorly disguised as concern for my well-being. The irony wasn't lost on me that while they viewed me as their personal bank, they also saw me as increasingly fragile and incapable. Rebecca would roll her eyes when I mentioned wanting to travel, suggesting that perhaps a nice staycation would be more suitable for someone my age. Marcus treated me like I might shatter if I lifted anything heavier than a coffee cup, constantly hovering and insisting I shouldn't be climbing ladders or tending to my garden. Patricia spoke to me in that careful, patronizing tone people use with elderly relatives they assume are losing their mental faculties. The truth was, I felt more energetic and capable than I had in years. I'd started working with a personal trainer 6 months earlier, a fierce woman named Carmen, who pushed me harder than anyone had in decades. I was hiking 3 miles every morning, practicing yoga, and had even taken up rock climbing at an indoor gym. My doctor consistently praised my health markers, and my mind was sharper than ever. But my children saw what they wanted to see: an aging mother whose primary value was her willingness to fund their lifestyles. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in March. Rebecca had called a family meeting, which in our household meant everyone gathering in my living room while I served dinner and listened to whatever new financial crisis required my attention. This time was different, though. Instead of asking for money, they were making an announcement. Derek cleared his throat importantly, the way he always did when he was about to deliver what he considered significant news. He explained that he'd been selected for a business conference in London, and Rebecca had decided to turn it into a family vacation. They'd booked a 3-week European tour, visiting London, Paris, Amsterdam, and Rome. Marcus would be joining them, along with Patricia, and even the teenagers were excited about missing school for this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I listened with growing excitement, already imagining the trip and wondering about logistics. I'd been to Europe only once, on my honeymoon 45 years ago, and I'd always dreamed of returning. My mind raced with possibilities, museums I wanted to visit, restaurants I'd read about, walking tours through historic neighborhoods. I was about to ask about dates, and start discussing travel arrangements when Rebecca interrupted my thoughts. She explained, with that careful tone she'd perfected over the years, that they'd all agreed this trip would be too strenuous for me. Too much walking, too many time zone changes, too much uncertainty. She painted a picture of me struggling with cobblestone streets and foreign languages, becoming a burden that would slow down their itinerary. Derek nodded sagely, adding that European hotels often had smaller rooms and older elevators, infrastructure that wouldn't be suitable for someone with my mobility limitations. I sat there, fork halfway to my mouth, staring at these people I'd raised and supported for decades. Mobility limitations. I wanted to laugh. That morning, I'd completed a 2-hour advanced yoga class, and then hiked to the Hollywood sign with Carmen. But in their minds, I was a fragile elderly woman who couldn't handle the rigors of international travel. Marcus jumped in with what he clearly thought was a generous offer. He suggested I use this time to relax, maybe book myself a nice spa weekend somewhere local while they were gone. Patricia nodded enthusiastically, proposing that this could be my opportunity for a digital detox and some solo meditation retreats. They spoke about me as if I weren't sitting right there, planning my consolation prize while they embarked on the adventure I'd been funding through years of supporting their various endeavors. The worst part wasn't their assumptions about my capabilities. It was the casual way they'd planned this entire trip without including me, then presented their exclusion as a kindness. They'd already booked flights, reserved hotels, and created detailed itineraries. This wasn't a spontaneous decision. It was a calculated choice to leave me behind while enjoying a vacation that, indirectly, my money had made possible. I excused myself from the table, claiming I needed to check on something in the kitchen. In reality, I needed a moment to process what had just happened. I stood at the sink, hands gripping the counter, staring out at the Pacific Ocean through my window. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and for the first time in years, I felt completely alone in my own home. When I returned to the dining room, they were already discussing restaurant reservations in Paris and museum tickets in Rome. I sat back down and continued eating, nodding politely when they asked for my opinion on various tourist attractions, as if I were a travel agent rather than someone who might have wanted to see those places herself. That night, after everyone had gone back to their respective living spaces on my property, I sat in my home office surrounded by decades of financial records. Bank statements showing tuition payments, mortgage assistance, business loans that were never repaid, medical bills I'd covered, and countless other expenses I'd absorbed without question. I calculated that over the past 10 years alone, I'd given my children over $800,000 in direct support, not including the free housing I provided to Marcus and Patricia. I thought about my late husband James, and how he used to joke that our children would be the death of us financially. He'd passed away 12 years ago, leaving me with enough life insurance and investment returns to live comfortably, but also leaving me as the sole source of support for 3 adult children who'd never learned to stand on their own feet. I'd continued his pattern of generosity, perhaps even expanded it, believing that supporting my family was what good mothers did. But sitting there in the quiet of my office, surrounded by evidence of my decades of giving, I realized something had shifted. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about how to help them or what they might need next. I was thinking about what I wanted, what I'd been putting aside, what dreams I'd deferred while funding theirs. I pulled out my laptop and began researching travel options. Not spa weekends or meditation retreats, but real travel. International flights, luxury accommodations, guided tours, and experiences I'd been telling myself I was too old or too settled to pursue.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
As I browsed through travel websites, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, genuine excitement about my own future, independent of my children's needs or opinions. The next morning, I woke up with unusual clarity about what needed to happen. I made my regular coffee, took my vitamins, and checked my email just like any other day. But instead of my usual routine of reviewing my children's various requests and planning how to accommodate their schedules, I opened a new browser tab and began making very different kinds of plans. I called my financial advisor, Margaret, whom I'd been working with for 15 years. I explained that I wanted to restructure some of my investments and access funds for a significant travel budget. She was initially surprised, knowing that I typically kept my spending conservative and focused on family support, but she quickly shifted into planning mode. We discussed liquidating some stocks, adjusting my portfolio for increased cash flow, and setting up international banking arrangements. Next, I contacted Carmen, my trainer, and asked her about travel fitness programs. She was thrilled to learn about my plans and immediately began designing workout routines I could maintain while traveling, along with specific strengthening exercises to ensure I'd be prepared for extensive walking and varied physical activities. She also recommended travel gear, lightweight luggage, comfortable walking shoes, and portable exercise equipment. By afternoon, I'd spoken with 3 different luxury travel agencies, each specializing in high-end international experiences for discerning clients. I wasn't interested in budget accommodations or group tours designed for elderly travelers. I wanted the kind of trip my children assumed I couldn't handle: 5-star hotels, private guides, exclusive access to attractions, and itineraries that would challenge and excite me. The irony wasn't lost on me that while my family planned their European adventure on a timeline that accommodated Derek's business conference and the children's school schedule, I was designing a trip based solely on my own interests and optimal travel conditions. I could leave whenever I wanted, stay as long as I pleased, and visit destinations that appealed to me rather than compromise based on group consensus. When Rebecca called that evening to discuss some detail about their upcoming trip, I mentioned casually that I'd been looking into some travel options of my own. She sounded pleased, probably imagining I'd taken her suggestion about local spa treatments seriously. When I mentioned I was considering international travel, her tone shifted to that familiar note of concern. She began listing all the reasons why international travel might be challenging for someone my age, particularly traveling alone. She worried about language barriers, navigation in foreign cities, medical emergencies far from familiar doctors, and the general stress of managing complex itineraries. Her concerns sounded rehearsed, as if she'd been preparing these arguments since our family meeting. I listened patiently, thanking her for her thoughtfulness, and didn't mention that I'd already consulted with a travel medicine specialist about health precautions, hired a company that specializes in solo travel support for independent seniors, and arranged for comprehensive international health insurance that included emergency evacuation coverage. I also didn't mention that I spoke conversational French and Italian, languages I'd been secretly studying online for the past 2 years during the quiet hours, when everyone assumed I was napping. The conversation ended with Rebecca suggesting we discuss my travel ideas more thoroughly as a family, which I knew meant another intervention designed to redirect my plans towards something they considered more appropriate. I agreed to the discussion while privately acknowledging that their input would be noted but not necessarily followed. That weekend, I received the first draft of a travel itinerary from Elena, the travel specialist I'd decided to work with. It was breathtaking in scope and luxury. The trip would begin in Switzerland, where I'd rent a private villa in Verbier for 2 weeks, complete with a personal chef and daily excursions into the Alps. From there, I'd spend 10 days in Tuscany, at a restored medieval castle that had been converted into an exclusive resort, followed by a week on the French Riviera, in an oceanfront suite in Cannes. The itinerary included private museum tours, cooking classes with Michelin-starred chefs, helicopter tours of scenic landscapes, and even a hot air balloon ride over the Loire Valley. Elena had also arranged for a traveling companion, a professional travel assistant named Sophia, who specialized in supporting independent luxury travelers. Sophia would handle logistics, provide local expertise, and ensure I had support available while maintaining my independence and privacy. The total cost was significant enough that I knew my children would be horrified, not just by the expense but by what it represented. This wasn't a modest vacation budget. This was the kind of money they associated with their inheritance, being spent on experiences rather than preserved for their future benefit. But as I reviewed the itinerary, I felt a joy I hadn't experienced in years. This was my money, my life, my chance to create memories that belonged entirely to me. The family meeting to discuss my travel plans was scheduled for the following Sunday. I spent the week finalizing arrangements with Elena, completing my travel health consultations, and purchasing everything I'd need for the trip. I even hired a personal shopper to help me select appropriate clothing for various climates and activities, from hiking gear for the Alps to elegant evening wear for fine dining in Cannes. By the time Sunday arrived, my trip was fully booked and confirmed. I had travel insurance, international phone plans, and detailed itineraries. I'd arranged for property management services to maintain my house and grounds while I was away, and I'd even hired additional security to ensure everything would be perfectly maintained in my absence. My children arrived for our family meeting with the same energy they brought to previous interventions, ready to gently redirect their misguided mother toward more sensible choices. Rebecca had prepared a folder of information about senior-friendly local activities, while Patricia brought brochures for meditation retreats within driving distance. Marcus had researched assisted living facilities with travel programs, just in case I was feeling the need for more social interaction with people my own age. I served lunch, listened to their presentations, and thanked them for their thoughtfulness. Then I pulled out my own folder, Elena's itinerary, complete with photos of the villa in Switzerland, the castle in Tuscany, and the suite in Cannes. I explained my travel dates, which would begin 2 weeks before their European trip and extend 3 weeks beyond their return. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced with my family. Rebecca stared at the photos as if they were evidence of some cognitive decline. Derek repeatedly asked about the cost, clearly calculating what this meant for their future financial support. Marcus wanted to know who I'd be traveling with, unable to imagine that I might be capable of managing such a complex trip independently. Patricia questioned whether I'd really thought this through, whether I understood the physical demands of international travel. I answered their questions calmly and thoroughly. Yes, I understood the cost and had arranged my finances accordingly. Yes, I'd considered the physical demands and had been preparing with my trainer for months. Yes, I had support arranged, but no, I wouldn't be part of a group tour or assisted travel program. This was my trip, designed for my interests, at my pace. The conversation grew heated when Rebecca suggested that perhaps we could modify their European trip to include me, if I was really committed to international travel. She proposed that I could join them for the less strenuous portions of their itinerary, maybe just London and Paris, skipping the more walking-intensive destinations. Derek nodded enthusiastically, probably calculating how my presence might upgrade their accommodations and dining options. I thanked them for the offer but explained that I'd already committed to my own itinerary. I'd be leaving for Switzerland the following month, and I was looking forward to the independence and luxury of traveling on my own terms. I'd been accommodating other people's schedules and preferences for decades. It was time to prioritize my own interests. That's when the real intervention began. They tag-teamed me with concerns about my safety, my health, my judgment, and my financial responsibility. Rebecca suggested I was being reckless with money that should be preserved for healthcare expenses and family emergencies. Marcus worried that I was being taken advantage of by travel companies preying on wealthy seniors. Patricia questioned whether this sudden desire for adventure might be a sign of some underlying emotional or mental health issue. Their words stung not because I believed them, but because they revealed how little they actually knew about my capabilities and desires. They'd been so focused on seeing me as their safety net that they'd never bothered to see me as an individual with my own dreams and goals. I was their mother, their financial support, their childcare provider, but I wasn't a person with my own right to adventure and fulfillment. I excused myself again, this time to get dessert from the kitchen, but really to collect myself before responding to their concerns. When I returned with coffee and cake, I made an announcement that surprised even me with its clarity and finality. I explained that I appreciated their concern, but I was a grown woman with sound judgment and considerable resources. I'd made my decision about travel after careful consideration and professional consultation. Their approval wasn't required, and their disapproval wouldn't change my plans. I was leaving for Europe in 3 weeks, and I hoped they'd be supportive, but I wasn't asking for permission. The meeting ended awkwardly, with my children exchanging glances that clearly communicated their shared belief that I'd lost my mind. They gathered their materials and made polite but strained goodbyes, leaving me alone in my dining room with the remains of lunch and a stack of travel brochures. That evening, Patricia knocked on my door with what she clearly intended as a peace offering. She'd brought herbal tea and homemade cookies, and she wanted to have a heart-to-heart conversation about my travel plans. She curled up in my living room chair the way she'd done as a child, and for a moment, I thought she might actually be interested in understanding my perspective. Instead, she launched into a gentle but persistent campaign to convince me that my travel plans were a reaction to feeling left out of their European trip. She suggested that perhaps I was acting impulsively, trying to prove something to myself or to them. She offered to help me plan something more reasonable, maybe a nice cruise or a domestic trip to somewhere familiar and comfortable. I listened to her concerns and acknowledged that perhaps I was feeling left out of their travel plans. But I explained that my reaction wasn't to prove anything to them, it was to finally do something entirely for myself. I'd spent decades supporting their dreams and adventures. Now I wanted to create my own. Patricia seemed to understand, at least partially. She asked about my itinerary with genuine curiosity for the first time, and I found myself sharing details about the cooking classes in Tuscany and the art tours I'd arranged in various cities. For a few minutes, we had the kind of conversation I'd been hoping for, where she saw me as a person rather than just a mother. But then she circled back to her concerns about my safety and suggested that maybe Marcus could rearrange his schedule to accompany me. Or perhaps Rebecca could extend their European trip to overlap with mine, so we could meet up for a few days. Once again, my independent adventure was being reframed as something that needed family supervision or modification. I thanked her for her concern and told her I'd consider her suggestions, knowing I wouldn't change my plans but wanting to end our conversation on a positive note. After she left, I sat in my living room feeling both sadness and determination. I was sad that my family couldn't share my excitement about this adventure, but I was more determined than ever to prove to myself, if not to them, that I was capable of far more than they imagined. The final weeks before my departure were a whirlwind of preparation and subtle family pressure. Rebecca called daily with new concerns about my travel plans, often forwarding articles about travel scams targeting seniors or stories about elderly travelers facing medical emergencies abroad. Marcus stopped by frequently, ostensibly to help with pre-travel preparations, but really to assess my mental state and look for signs that I might be wavering in my decision. Meanwhile, I was working with Elena to finalize every detail of my itinerary. We arranged for airport assistance to ensure smooth transitions through security and customs, confirmed all reservations, and established communication protocols so she could provide support from Los Angeles while I traveled. Sophia, my travel companion, sent detailed profiles of herself and our planned activities, along with references from previous clients who praised her professionalism and expertise. I completed my travel health consultations, received all necessary vaccinations, and obtained prescriptions for any medications I might need abroad. My doctor, who'd been treating me for 15 years, was enthusiastic about my travel plans and assured me that I was in excellent health for international adventure. She provided medical clearance letters and emergency contact information, treating my concerns seriously rather than dismissing them as age-inappropriate fantasies. Carmen, my trainer, intensified our workout schedule to ensure I'd be physically prepared for extensive walking and varied activities. We practiced hiking with a day pack, climbing stairs with luggage, and maintaining balance on uneven surfaces. She was more excited about my trip than my own family, constantly asking for updates about my itinerary and making suggestions for maintaining fitness routines while traveling. 3 days before my departure, I received an unexpected visit from Derek. He arrived alone, without Rebecca, and asked if we could have a private conversation. I invited him into my home office, curious about what he might want to discuss without his wife present. Derek's approach was different from the rest of the family's interventions. Instead of focusing on my safety or mental state, he wanted to discuss the financial implications of my travel spending. He'd apparently done some research into luxury travel costs and was concerned about the impact on my long-term financial security and, by extension, on the family's future inheritance. He presented his concerns in business terms, creating spreadsheets that projected my current spending rate against my total assets and estimated lifespan. According to his calculations, if I continued spending at this level, I might exhaust my resources before I needed them for end-of-life care, potentially burdening my children with financial responsibility for my later years. I listened to his presentation with the same attention I'd given the others, but his approach sparked something different in me. Unlike the emotional appeals about my safety or capability, Derek's concerns were purely financial, and they revealed something important about how my family viewed our relationship. I thanked him for his analysis and then pulled out my own financial records, prepared by Margaret, my advisor. I showed him detailed projections of my current assets, ongoing income from investments, and projected expenses for various scenarios, including extended travel and potential healthcare needs. My financial position was stronger than he'd estimated, and my travel budget represented a small percentage of my available resources. More importantly, I explained my philosophy about money and legacy. I'd worked hard and saved carefully so I could enjoy financial security and freedom in my later years. I had no intention of living as a miser, hoarding resources for heirs who already benefited significantly from my generosity. If I chose to spend my money on experiences and adventures, that was my right as the person who'd earned it. Derek seemed genuinely surprised by the strength of my financial position and the thoughtfulness of my planning. He'd apparently assumed that my travel spending was impulsive and poorly considered, rather than a carefully planned allocation of resources I could easily afford. For the first time in our conversation, he asked about my trip with interest rather than concern, wanting to know about the specific experiences I'd planned and why they appealed to me. We talked for over an hour about travel, adventure, and the difference between existing and living. Derek admitted that he sometimes felt envious of my freedom to make independent choices, constrained as he was by work obligations and family responsibilities. I reminded him that I'd had those same constraints for decades, and that this freedom was something I'd earned through years of putting other people's needs first. Our conversation ended on a warmer note than I'd expected. Derek didn't withdraw his concerns about my travel plans, but he seemed to understand them better. He asked if I'd be willing to share updates about my trip, not for safety monitoring, but because he was genuinely curious about my experiences. I agreed, touched by what seemed like the first authentic interest any family member had shown in my adventure. The day before my departure, I spent the morning finalizing packing and reviewing travel documents. My suitcases were filled with carefully selected clothing for various climates and activities, along with all the gear Carmen had recommended for staying active while traveling. I'd packed light but purposefully, bringing everything I'd need for 6 weeks of luxury and adventure. That afternoon, my entire family gathered for what they announced as a farewell dinner. I'd prepared an elaborate meal, featuring many of their favorite dishes, and the atmosphere was unusually warm and sentimental. For a few hours, they set aside their concerns about my travel plans and focused on expressing their love and affection. Rebecca shared memories of trips we'd taken together when she and her siblings were children, family vacations that had been carefully planned around everyone's interests and limitations. Marcus talked about how much he'd learned from watching me navigate challenges and solve problems, skills he said he was still developing in his own life. Patricia reminisced about our conversations over the years, times when I'd listened to her dreams and supported her various ventures, even when others were skeptical. Their words were touching, and I found myself getting emotional as they shared their appreciation for my role in their lives. But I also noticed that even in their expressions of love, they focused on my function as their mother and supporter, rather than recognizing me as an individual with my own interests and dreams. As the evening wound down, Rebecca made one final attempt to modify my travel plans. She suggested that perhaps I could postpone my trip by a few weeks so we could coordinate our European travel, maybe even meeting up for a few days in Switzerland or France. The offer was genuine, and I could see that she was trying to find a compromise that would address their concerns while acknowledging my desire for adventure. I thanked her for the suggestion, but confirmed that my plans would remain unchanged. I was looking forward to the independence of solo travel, to making my own schedule and following my own interests without needing to accommodate anyone else's preferences or limitations. This was my adventure, and I intended to experience it entirely on my own terms. The next morning, I woke before dawn with the excited energy I remembered from childhood Christmas mornings. My flight to Switzerland was leaving Los Angeles at noon, and I had several hours of final preparations before my driver arrived to take me to the airport. I reviewed my itinerary one final time, confirmed all my arrangements, and packed the last few items in my carry-on bag. Carmen arrived early to help me with final stretching and to review the travel fitness plan she'd prepared. We went through the exercises I could do in hotel rooms, walking techniques for cobblestone streets, and strategies for staying active during long flight connections. She was almost as excited as I was, making me promise to send photos from my alpine hikes and cooking classes. Margaret, my financial advisor, called to confirm that all my international banking arrangements were in place and to wish me well on my adventure. She'd arranged for emergency funds to be available anywhere in the world, and had provided me with contact information for financial support services in each country I'd be visiting. Elena, my travel specialist, sent a final message confirming that Sophia would meet me at the Geneva airport and that all my reservations were confirmed. She'd also arranged for a welcome package to be waiting at my villa in Verbier, including local wines, specialty foods, and a personalized guidebook highlighting attractions that matched my interests. By 10 o'clock, my family had gathered to see me off. They helped carry my luggage to the front door and took photos of me in my travel outfit, looking excited and confident. Despite all their concerns about my plans, they seemed genuinely proud as they watched me prepare for this adventure. Marcus handed me a small wrapped package, explaining that it was a travel journal they'd all contributed to, with messages of love and encouragement for each destination on my itinerary. Patricia gave me a beautiful silk scarf she'd designed herself, saying she wanted me to have something unique to wear during my elegant evenings in Europe. Rebecca presented me with a high-quality camera, complete with extra batteries and memory cards so I could document every detail of my experiences. Their gifts touched me deeply, representing a shift from their earlier resistance to something approaching support and enthusiasm. As my driver loaded my luggage into the car, I hugged each of them and promised to stay in touch, to share photos and stories, and to return with exciting tales of adventure. The drive to LAX took just over an hour, giving me time to review my travel documents and reflect on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 6 weeks ago, I'd been sitting in my dining room listening to my family plan a European vacation that didn't include me, feeling invisible and undervalued. Now I was heading to the airport for my own European adventure, one that promised luxury, independence, and experiences I'd been dreaming about for years. As we pulled up to the international terminal, I felt a surge of anticipation unlike anything I'd experienced in decades. This wasn't just a vacation, this was a declaration of independence, a statement that my life was far from over, and that I was capable of far more than anyone, including myself, had imagined. I tipped my driver generously and walked into the terminal, pulling my luggage behind me, heading toward the first-class check-in counter and the beginning of an adventure that would prove, once and for all, that being 71 years old didn't mean being frail, limited, or finished. It meant being experienced, confident, and finally free to live entirely for myself. The moment I stepped off the plane in Geneva, I understood why people talked about European air differently. There was something crisp and clean about it, carrying hints of snow from distant mountains and the promise of adventures I'd only read about in travel magazines. Sophia was waiting for me at customs, exactly as Elena had promised, holding a small sign with my name written in elegant script. She was younger than I'd expected, perhaps 40, with the kind of confident posture that comes from years of managing complex logistics for demanding clients. Sophia greeted me in flawless English with just a trace of a Swiss accent, immediately taking charge of my luggage and guiding me through the airport with practiced efficiency. She'd arranged for a private car service, and within minutes we were gliding through Swiss countryside in a Mercedes sedan with heated leather seats and panoramic windows that framed the landscape like moving artwork. During the 90-minute drive to Verbier, Sophia briefed me on the coming weeks with the kind of detailed preparation I'd never experienced on any family vacation. She knew about my hiking experience with Carmen, my interest in cooking, and my desire for cultural experiences that went beyond typical tourist attractions. She'd researched my preferences through Elena and had customized every aspect of my stay to match my interests and energy level. The villa Elena had selected was even more stunning than the photographs had suggested. Perched on a mountainside with commanding views of the Alps, it was a modern interpretation of traditional Swiss architecture. All clean lines and enormous windows designed to showcase the spectacular surroundings. The interior was sophisticated without being sterile, furnished with contemporary pieces that complemented rather than competed with the natural beauty visible from every room. Sophia showed me through the villa with obvious pride, pointing out details that had been arranged specifically for my comfort. The kitchen was equipped with professional-grade appliances and stocked with local ingredients for the cooking lessons I'd arranged. The master suite included a sitting area positioned to take advantage of sunrise views over the mountains. The guest rooms were prepared for Sophia and the personal chef, Michel, who would be preparing my meals and teaching me regional specialties. What struck me most powerfully was the silence. After decades of living in a house filled with the constant demands and drama of my adult children, The peaceful quiet of the mountains felt almost revolutionary. I could hear wind through pine trees, distant church bells from the village below, and my own breathing as I stood on the terrace taking in views that stretched to horizons I'd never imagined. That first evening, Michel prepared a welcome dinner that was both a meal and an education. He designed the menu to introduce me to regional ingredients and cooking techniques, starting with a delicate soup made from local mushrooms and finishing with a dessert featuring pears poached in wine from nearby vineyards. Between courses, he explained the history and preparation of each dish, treating me like a serious student rather than a tourist seeking entertainment. After dinner, Sophia and I reviewed the detailed itinerary she'd prepared for my 2 weeks in Switzerland. She'd balanced active outdoor adventures with cultural experiences and relaxation, creating a schedule that would challenge me without overwhelming me. Tomorrow would begin with a gentle introduction to alpine hiking, followed by an afternoon exploring the local village and markets. The coming days would include more ambitious hikes, cooking lessons with Michel, visits to nearby historical sites, and even a helicopter tour of glaciers that were otherwise inaccessible. I called Rebecca that evening to let her know I'd arrived safely, as I'd promised during our farewell. She sounded relieved to hear from me, and I could tell she'd been genuinely worried, despite all her objections to my travel plans. I described the villa and the views, the professional arrangements Sophia had made, and the dinner Michel had prepared. For the first time since I'd announced my travel plans, Rebecca sounded impressed rather than concerned. She asked detailed questions about Sophia's qualifications and experience, clearly reassessing her assumptions about solo travel for seniors. When I mentioned the helicopter tour and advanced hiking plans, she expressed surprise rather than alarm, seeming to realize that my itinerary was far more sophisticated and physically demanding than anything she'd imagined I could handle. Our conversation ended warmly, with Rebecca asking me to send photos and promising to share my updates with Marcus and Patricia. I hung up feeling more connected to my family than I had in months, not because they'd changed their minds about my capabilities, but because I was finally demonstrating those capabilities in ways they couldn't dismiss or minimize. My first week in Switzerland exceeded every expectation I dared to form. The hiking trails Sophia selected challenged me without being beyond my abilities, taking me through landscapes that shifted from pastoral meadows to dramatic rocky outcrops, with views that took my breath away for reasons that had nothing to do with altitude. I discovered muscles I'd forgotten I had, and stamina I didn't know I possessed, returning from each day's adventure tired but exhilarated rather than exhausted. The cooking lessons with Michel were revelatory in ways I hadn't anticipated. I'd been cooking for my family for decades, preparing familiar dishes that satisfied their preferences without challenging my own skills. Michel taught me techniques I'd never attempted, and introduced me to flavor combinations that opened my palate to entirely new possibilities. We made fresh pasta from scratch, prepared complex sauces that required patience and precision, and created desserts that were works of art as much as food. More importantly, Michel treated my culinary education seriously, pushing me to master difficult techniques and explaining the science behind cooking methods I'd been using intuitively for years. He didn't condescend or simplify his instruction based on my age. Instead, he challenged me to expand my skills and knowledge in ways that made me feel intellectually engaged and creatively stimulated. Sophia proved to be more than a logistics coordinator. She became a cultural interpreter and adventure companion who enhanced every experience without ever making me feel dependent or supervised. She knew when to provide guidance and when to step back, when to share historical context and when to let me simply absorb the beauty of a moment. Her presence gave me confidence to try new things, while preserving my sense of independence and personal discovery. By the end of my first week, I was video calling my family with updates that seemed to surprise them as much as they delighted me. I showed them photos from my hikes, demonstrated cooking techniques Michel had taught me, and described cultural experiences that were far more sophisticated than anything they'd expected from my travels. Patricia seemed particularly intrigued by my cooking adventures, asking detailed questions about the techniques Michel was teaching and the local ingredients we were using. She'd always been interested in food and cooking but had never pursued formal training, preferring to treat it as another of her creative hobbies rather than developing serious skills. I found myself describing Michel's methods with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for much younger students. Marcus was fascinated by my hiking achievements, repeatedly asking about distances and elevation gains with what seemed like genuine admiration. I'd been hiking regularly with Carmen for months, but my family had dismissed it as gentle exercise suitable for my age, rather than recognizing it as serious physical conditioning. Now, as I described challenging mountain trails and multi-hour adventures, Marcus seemed to be reassessing his assumptions about my physical capabilities. Rebecca was most interested in the practical aspects of my travel arrangements, asking detailed questions about Sophia's services and how I was managing the complexities of international travel. She'd clearly expected me to struggle with language barriers, navigation challenges, and the general stress of being in unfamiliar environments. Instead, I was describing smoothly managed experiences and growing confidence in my ability to handle unexpected situations. During my second week in Switzerland, Sophia arranged for increasingly ambitious adventures that tested both my physical abilities and my comfort with new experiences. We took the helicopter tour of glaciers I'd been anticipating, soaring over landscapes that seemed almost impossible in their dramatic beauty. I'd never been in a helicopter before, and at 71 I discovered that I loved the combination of exhilaration and peaceful perspective that came from viewing the world from such heights. The cooking lessons with Michelle culminated in planning and preparing a dinner party for 6, featuring dishes I'd learned during my stay. Sophia had invited a carefully selected group of local residents who shared my interests in food, travel, and outdoor adventures. The evening was conducted entirely in English for my benefit, but the conversation ranged across multiple languages and cultures as my guests shared stories of their own travels and adventures. I found myself holding my own in discussions about international cuisine, mountain climbing in various countries, and cultural differences I'd observed during my week in Switzerland. These were conversations I'd never had with my own family, who saw me primarily in my role as mother and financial supporter, rather than as someone with independent interests and insights worth sharing. The dinner I prepared was ambitious by any standard, featuring techniques Michelle had taught me and ingredients we'd selected together from local markets. I made fresh ravioli with a filling of local cheese and herbs, prepared a lamb dish with a sauce that required hours of patient reduction, and created a dessert that combined traditional Swiss elements with my own creative touches. The meal was a success not just because the food was delicious, but because I demonstrated mastery of complex techniques in front of an audience that appreciated the skill required. My guests were impressed not just by the food but by my story. When I mentioned that this was my first extended solo travel experience at 71, they responded with admiration rather than surprise. Several shared stories of their own late-in-life adventures, treating my Swiss expedition as impressive rather than unusual. One woman, a retired professor from Geneva, told me she'd taken up mountain climbing at 65 and was still tackling challenging peaks at 78. These conversations opened my perspective on what was possible for someone my age in ways my family's concerns never could. Instead of focusing on limitations and risks, my new acquaintances discussed possibilities and adventures. They treated aging as an opportunity for new experiences, rather than a reason to avoid challenges, and their attitudes were infectious in the best possible way. As my time in Switzerland drew to a close, I realized that the experience had changed me in fundamental ways. I'd proven to myself that I was capable of far more than I'd believed, but more importantly, I discovered interests and passions I'd never had the opportunity to explore. The cooking lessons had awakened a creative side I'd suppressed for years, and the hiking adventures had connected me with a love of nature and physical challenge I'd forgotten I possessed. Sophia helped me pack for the next portion of my journey, carefully wrapping the local cheeses and wines I'd purchased to take with me to Italy. We reviewed the transition arrangements Elena had made, confirmed my transportation to the airport, and discussed the itinerary waiting for me in Tuscany. I was sad to leave Switzerland, but excited about the castle resort Elena had selected for my next adventure. On my final morning in Verbier, I woke before dawn and walked out onto the villa's terrace to watch the sunrise paint the Alps in shades of gold and pink. The silence was complete except for the sound of my own breathing and the distant tinkling of cowbells from pastures far below. I stood there for nearly an hour, memorizing every detail of a moment I knew I'd want to remember for the rest of my life. Michelle prepared a farewell breakfast featuring all my favorite discoveries from our cooking lessons together. He'd written out detailed recipes for the dishes I'd enjoyed most, adapting them for home preparation and suggesting where I might find similar ingredients in California. He also gave me a collection of Swiss cooking tools I'd admired, insisting they were essential for recreating the techniques he'd taught me. Sophia presented me with a leather-bound journal containing detailed notes about every experience we'd shared, complete with photographs and maps showing the routes we'd hiked. She'd also included contact information for similar services in Italy and France, along with her personal recommendations for experiences that would build on what I'd learned in Switzerland. The drive back to Geneva gave me time to reflect on how much I'd changed during my 2 weeks in the mountains. I'd arrived feeling uncertain about my decision to travel alone, worried that my family might be right about my limitations and the wisdom of my ambitious plans. I was leaving with confidence in my abilities and excitement about the adventures still ahead. At the airport, Sophia helped me check in for my flight to Florence and made sure I had all the information I needed for meeting my next contact in Italy. We'd developed a genuine friendship during our time together, and saying goodbye was emotional for both of us. She made me promise to send updates about my continuing travels and to contact her if I ever returned to Switzerland. The flight to Florence was smooth and gave me an opportunity to read about Tuscany and review the itinerary waiting for me at the castle resort. Elena had selected a converted medieval fortress that promised to be even more luxurious than my Swiss villa, with amenities that included a world-class spa, private wine cellars, and cooking classes taught by chefs from nearby Michelin-starred restaurants. As the plane descended toward Florence, I caught my first glimpse of the Tuscan countryside, rolling green hills, dotted with cypress trees, and ancient stone buildings that looked exactly like the travel posters I'd admired for years. I felt the same excitement I'd experienced arriving in Geneva, but now it was tempered with confidence earned through 2 weeks of successful adventures. My phone buzzed with a text message from Rebecca asking about my travel day and confirming my safe arrival in Italy. I responded with a photo from the airplane window showing the Tuscan landscape below, adding a note that I was excited about the cooking classes and wine tours planned for the coming week. Her response was immediate and enthusiastic, asking for details about my Swiss experiences and expressing what seemed like genuine excitement about my continuing adventure. The transformation in my family's attitude had been gradual, but unmistakable. They'd started our conversations with concern and skepticism, but as I'd shared photos and stories of my successful experiences, their tone had shifted to interest and admiration. They were beginning to see me as someone capable of independent adventure, rather than someone who needed protection from the world. As I collected my luggage in Florence and looked for the driver Elena had arranged to take me to the castle resort, I realized that proving my capabilities to my family had become less important than discovering those capabilities myself. I was no longer traveling to show them what I could do. I was traveling because I'd fallen in love with the person I became when I was free to follow my own interests and push my own boundaries. The drive through Tuscany was like traveling through a living painting, with every turn revealing new vistas of vineyards, olive groves, and hilltop villages that seemed unchanged by centuries. My driver, Lorenzo, spoke excellent English and provided running commentary about the history and culture of the region, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories that brought the landscape to life. The Castello di Bellavista appeared suddenly as we crested a hill, rising from its surroundings, like something from a fairy tale. The medieval fortress had been restored with exquisite attention to historical detail, while incorporating modern luxury amenities that promised comfort without compromising authenticity. Ancient stone walls enclosed manicured gardens, and the central courtyard featured a fountain that had been flowing for over 500 years. Elena had arranged for me to stay in the tower suite, a circular room at the top of the castle's highest point, with windows providing panoramic views of the surrounding countryside. The room itself was a masterpiece of restoration, with original stone walls and wooden beams complemented by contemporary furnishings that enhanced, rather than overwhelmed, the historical atmosphere. My hostess, Francesca, was a member of the family that had owned the castle for generations before converting it into an exclusive resort. She welcomed me personally, providing a tour that included both public spaces and private areas not normally accessible to guests. Her pride in the castle's history was infectious, and her detailed knowledge of local culture promised to enhance every aspect of my stay. That evening, I joined a small group of fellow guests for dinner in the castle's medieval dining hall, a magnificent space with vaulted ceilings and walls decorated with frescoes dating back centuries. The menu featured local specialties prepared with ingredients grown on the castle's own grounds, and each course was paired with wines from the family's private cellars. My fellow guests were an international mix of sophisticated travelers, including a retired diplomat from England, a gallery owner from New York, and a chef from Australia who was researching traditional Italian techniques. The conversation was stimulating and wide-ranging, covering topics from art history to culinary traditions to travel experiences around the world. I found myself contributing to these discussions with confidence I'd never felt in social situations, sharing stories from my Swiss adventures, and asking informed questions about Italian culture and history. The cooking classes with Michelle had given me vocabulary and knowledge I'd never possessed, and my hiking experiences had provided stories worth sharing with fellow adventure travelers. When the diplomat mentioned his own solo travel experiences and the chef described her culinary research trips, I realized I was part of a community of people who prioritized learning and adventure over safety and comfort. These were people who understood why someone might choose to climb mountains at 71 or learn complex cooking techniques in foreign countries rather than settling for familiar routines and predictable experiences. As dinner concluded and we moved to the castle's terrace for coffee and grappa, I looked out over the Tuscan countryside illuminated by moonlight and felt a deep satisfaction I'd never experienced before. This wasn't just a vacation, it was a completely new way of living, one that prioritized personal growth and authentic experiences over the obligations and limitations I'd accepted for decades. My phone rang as I was preparing for bed, and I was surprised to see Marcus's name on the screen. He rarely called in the evenings, preferring to communicate through quick text messages or brief conversations during his frequent visits to my house. This call felt different, more personal and thoughtful. Marcus had been following my travel updates on the family group chat Rebecca had created, and he wanted to tell me how impressed he was by my adventures. He mentioned specific details from my photos and stories, showing that he'd been paying careful attention rather than just skimming my messages. He asked thoughtful questions about my experiences, and seemed genuinely interested in understanding what made these adventures meaningful to me. More surprisingly, Marcus began sharing his own thoughts about travel and adventure, dreams he'd put aside during his marriage and career struggles. He talked about places he'd always wanted to visit and experiences he'd been afraid to pursue, fears that seemed to echo some of the limitations I'd imposed on myself over the years. Our conversation lasted over an hour, covering topics we'd never discussed before. Marcus admitted that he'd been envious of my courage in planning such an ambitious solo trip, and he asked for advice about how to start pursuing his own travel dreams. For the first time in our adult relationship, he was seeking my guidance not as his financial supporter, but as someone who'd successfully navigated challenges he was still facing. As we talked, I realized that my travel adventures were having an unexpected impact on my family. They weren't just observing my experiences, they were reconsidering their own limitations and assumptions. My willingness to take risks and try new things was inspiring them to question whether they were living as fully as they might. When Marcus mentioned that he'd been researching solo travel options for divorced men his age, I felt a pride that had nothing to do with his accomplishments and everything to do with his growth. He was thinking beyond his current circumstances and imagining possibilities he'd previously dismissed as unrealistic or inappropriate. Our conversation ended with Marcus asking me to send more detailed updates about my Italian experiences, particularly the cooking classes and cultural activities I had planned. He wanted to understand not just what I was doing, but why these experiences mattered to me, how they were changing my perspective on what was possible at our respective stages of life. After hanging up, I sat in my tower room looking out at the starlit Tuscan countryside and reflecting on how much had changed since I'd left Los Angeles. I'd started this journey to prove that I was capable of more than my family believed, but I was discovering that the most important person I needed to convince was myself. The next morning brought my first cooking class at the castle, taught by Chef Giuliano from a nearby restaurant that had earned its first Michelin star the previous year. Unlike my lessons with Michelle in Switzerland, which had focused on regional specialties and traditional techniques, Giuliano was teaching contemporary interpretations of classic Italian dishes that required both technical skill and creative vision. The class included 4 other guests, all serious food enthusiasts with varying levels of cooking experience. Giuliano treated us as culinary students rather than tourists, expecting precision in our knife work and attention to detail in our preparation methods. He demonstrated techniques I'd read about but never attempted, then guided us through hands-on practice until we could execute them competently. We made fresh pasta using techniques that had been passed down through Giuliano's family for generations, prepared sauces that required patient attention to achieve perfect consistency, and created presentations that elevated simple ingredients into sophisticated dishes. The physical demands were considerable, requiring stamina and focus that reminded me of my hiking challenges in Switzerland. What impressed me most was Giuliano's assumption that we were capable of mastering difficult techniques regardless of our age or previous experience. He pushed me to attempt preparations I might have considered beyond my abilities, then provided guidance that made success achievable. His confidence in my potential was infectious, encouraging me to attempt challenges I would have avoided in the past. The meal we prepared together was extraordinary, not just because of the food, but because of the sense of accomplishment that came from mastering new skills under demanding conditions. I'd created dishes that rivaled anything I'd eaten in fine restaurants, using techniques I'd learned that very morning. The other students were equally impressed with their achievements, and we celebrated our success with wines Giuliano had selected to complement our creations. That afternoon, Francesca arranged for a private tour of local vineyards, including a visit to a family winery that had been producing wine for over 3 centuries. The tour included not just tasting, but education about viticulture, winemaking techniques, and the impact of climate and soil on flavor development. I learned to identify characteristics I'd never noticed before, and developed vocabulary for describing wines with precision and confidence. The vineyard owner, Paolo, was passionate about his craft and treated our small group as serious students rather than casual tourists. He explained traditional methods alongside modern innovations, showed us historical cellars alongside contemporary production facilities, and shared wines that represented different approaches to expressing the unique character of Tuscan terroir. By evening, I was exhausted but exhilarated, my mind filled with new knowledge, and my confidence boosted by successful completion of challenging educational experiences. I'd been intellectually stimulated, in ways I hadn't experienced since my college years, reminded that learning and growth weren't limited to youth but could continue throughout life if I remained open to new possibilities. I called Patricia that evening to share details about my cooking class and wine education, knowing she'd be particularly interested in the creative and cultural aspects of my experiences. Her response was more enthusiastic than I'd expected, with detailed questions about techniques Giuliano had taught and wines Paolo had shared. Patricia mentioned that she'd been inspired by my travel stories to research cooking classes in Los Angeles, particularly programs focused on international cuisines and advanced techniques. She'd always been creative with food, but had treated cooking as another of her artistic hobbies rather than developing serious skills. My experiences were encouraging her to pursue more structured learning and challenge herself with more demanding projects. Our conversation revealed a side of Patricia. I rarely saw the serious student rather than the dilettante. She asked thoughtful questions about my learning process, wanted to understand how I'd overcome intimidation about attempting unfamiliar techniques, and seemed genuinely interested in applying similar approaches to her own creative development. When Patricia mentioned that she'd been reconsidering her approach to all her creative pursuits, inspired by my willingness to push beyond my comfort zone, I realized that my travel adventures were having ripple effects I'd never anticipated. My family wasn't just observing my experiences, they were using them as models for their own personal growth and risk-taking. The remainder of my week in Tuscany continued to exceed my expectations, with each day bringing new challenges and discoveries that expanded my sense of what was possible. I took advanced cooking classes that built on skills I'd developed earlier, participated in cultural tours that deepened my understanding of Italian history and art, and even tried my hand at traditional crafts like pottery and fresco painting. Each experience required me to push beyond previous limitations, whether physical, intellectual, or creative. I discovered that I had artistic abilities I'd never explored, stamina for complex projects I'd never attempted, and confidence in unfamiliar situations I'd never tested. Most importantly, I found that I thrived on challenges that required sustained effort and concentration, experiences that engaged me fully rather than simply entertaining me passively. The transformation in my self-perception was profound and permanent. I was no longer someone who'd reached the limits of growth and adventure. I was someone who was just beginning to discover my potential. The person my family had seen as too frail for their European vacation was capable of far more than any of us had imagined, and I was eager to continue pushing those boundaries even further. My final morning at Castello di Bella Vista brought an unexpected encounter that would reshape the entire trajectory of my European adventure. While enjoying breakfast on the terrace overlooking the Tuscan countryside, I was approached by Alexandra Montclair, a sophisticated woman in her 50s who'd arrived the previous evening. She introduced herself as a luxury travel curator specializing in exclusive experiences for discerning clients, and she'd been observing my engagement with the castle's programs with professional interest. Alexandra explained that she'd been developing a new concept in luxury travel, creating bespoke adventures for accomplished individuals who sought challenges rather than mere comfort. She'd noticed my enthusiasm during the cooking classes, my thoughtful questions during cultural tours, and my obvious fitness level despite my age. What intrigued her most was my willingness to push beyond typical senior travel expectations, while maintaining the sophistication that came with experience and resources. She presented an opportunity that took my breath away, an invitation to join a small group of exceptional travelers for an exclusive program she was launching in the French Riviera. The experience would combine luxury accommodations with intensive cultural immersion, advanced culinary training, and physical adventures designed for people who refused to let age define their limitations. The program was invitation only, limited to 6 participants, and would conclude with a showcase event where participants would demonstrate skills they'd mastered during their stay. The timing was perfect, coinciding exactly with my planned week in Cannes. Alexandra's program would replace my original itinerary with something far more ambitious and exclusive. She showed me detailed materials describing the Via Emeraude, a restored Belle Epoque mansion overlooking the Mediterranean, where participants would live and train together while pursuing individual projects that showcased their personal interests and newly acquired skills. My fellow participants would include a retired conductor from Vienna who was learning traditional French perfume making, a former ambassador from Japan studying Provençal cooking techniques, a British art historian researching contemporary sculpture methods, and 2 other accomplished professionals pursuing creative challenges they'd deferred during their careers. Alexandra had specifically recruited people whose life experiences would create rich opportunities for mutual learning and inspiration. The program's culmination would be a private exhibition and dinner party for influential figures from the arts, culinary, and cultural communities of the French Riviera. Each participant would present their project publicly, demonstrating mastery of skills acquired during the intensive week-long program. It was exactly the kind of challenge I'd been unconsciously seeking. An opportunity to prove my capabilities not just to my family but to a wider community of accomplished individuals. I accepted Alexandra's invitation without hesitation, recognizing it as the perfect next step in a journey that had already exceeded my most ambitious expectations. She arranged for all necessary modifications to my travel plans, coordinating with Elena to ensure seamless transitions and comprehensive support. Within hours, my relatively conventional week in Cannes had been transformed into an exclusive artistic residency that would test my abilities in ways I'd never imagined. The transition from Tuscany to the French Riviera was managed with the same attention to detail I'd experienced throughout my travels. Alexandra personally accompanied me on the journey, using our travel time to brief me on the other participants and help me finalize my project proposal. I'd decided to focus on advanced patisserie techniques, building on the foundation I'd established during my cooking lessons in Switzerland and Italy, while pushing into the complex world of French dessert artistry. My choice reflected both practical considerations and personal ambition. I had sufficient culinary background to make rapid progress, but pastry work would require precision, creativity, and technical mastery that would challenge me significantly. The showcase dinner would provide the perfect venue for demonstrating sophisticated dessert presentations, and success would prove definitively that I'd mastered one of the most demanding aspects of professional cooking. Villa Emeraude exceeded even Alexandra's enthusiastic descriptions, a masterpiece of Belle Epoque architecture restored with contemporary luxury, while preserving every detail of its historical elegance. The property commanded spectacular views of the Mediterranean, with terraced gardens that provided both beauty and ingredients for our culinary projects. My suite included a private balcony overlooking the sea, and a sitting area equipped with everything I'd need for studying techniques and planning presentations. The other participants were as impressive as Alexandra had promised, each bringing decades of professional accomplishment and personal sophistication to our intensive program. Professor Yamamoto, the former ambassador, had represented Japan at the highest diplomatic levels and was now pursuing his lifelong passion for French cuisine with scholarly intensity. Maestro Weber, the retired conductor, approached perfume making with the same precision and artistry he'd brought to leading world-class orchestras. Dr. Hamilton, the British art historian, was exploring sculpture techniques that connected historical traditions with contemporary expression, while Margaret Chen, a former tech executive, was learning traditional jewelry-making methods using tools and techniques that hadn't changed in centuries. Our sixth participant, Thomas Rousseau, was a retired French literature professor who was studying winemaking with the goal of producing a vintage that captured the essence of Provençal terroir. What united us wasn't just our age demographic or financial resources, but our shared commitment to serious learning and personal challenge. None of us were dabbling or seeking easy entertainment. We were pursuing mastery of complex skills that would require sustained effort, intellectual engagement, and creative risk-taking. Alexandra had assembled a group of people who understood that true luxury meant the freedom to pursue excellence without compromise. My first day at Villa Amorosa began with an orientation that established the intensive nature of our program. We would work with master craftspeople and accomplished chefs, following schedules that demanded professional-level commitment and attention to detail. Our instructors were not entertainers or tour guides, but serious practitioners who expected us to approach our studies with corresponding seriousness. Chef Bernard Roussillon, who would be teaching me patisserie techniques, was a legendary figure in French culinary circles, holder of multiple Michelin stars and creator of desserts that had redefined contemporary pastry artistry. He'd agreed to work with Alexandra's program because he was intrigued by the concept of teaching accomplished older students who brought life experience and intellectual sophistication to their culinary education. Our first session together was both humbling and exhilarating. Chef Roussillon demonstrated techniques that required hand strength, coordination, and timing I wasn't sure I possessed, then guided me through practice sessions that revealed both my limitations and my potential. He was demanding but encouraging, pushing me to attempt procedures I might have considered beyond my abilities, while providing guidance that made success achievable. The complexity of professional patisserie work was unlike anything I'd encountered in my previous cooking experiences. Every measurement had to be precise, every timing perfect, every movement economical and purposeful. The margin for error was minimal, and the physical demands were considerable, requiring stamina and focus that reminded me of my most challenging hiking adventures. But I thrived under these demanding conditions, discovering that I performed better when challenged than when comfortable. Chef Roussillon's expectations forced me to concentrate completely, eliminating the distractions and self-doubt that had limited my previous culinary attempts. I was learning not just techniques but confidence in my ability to master complex skills through sustained effort and careful attention. My fellow participants were pursuing their own intensive studies with similar dedication and growing expertise. During our evening meals together, we shared challenges and breakthroughs, creating a community of mutual support and inspiration that enhanced everyone's individual progress. These conversations were intellectually stimulating in ways I'd rarely experienced, combining practical problem-solving with philosophical discussions about creativity, mastery, and personal growth. Professor Yamamoto's approach to French cooking was influenced by his diplomatic background, treating recipes as cultural documents that required careful interpretation and respectful adaptation. His insights into the intersection of cuisine and cultural identity added depth to my own understanding of why certain techniques had evolved, and why precision mattered so much in traditional French cooking. Maestro Weber brought musical principles to perfume creation, discussing scent compositions in terms of harmonies, progressions, and emotional resonance. His analytical approach to fragrance development helped me think about my own dessert presentations in terms of sensory orchestration, considering how flavors, textures, and visual elements could work together to create unified artistic statements. Dr. Hamilton's sculpture work emphasized the importance of understanding materials and respecting traditional methods while seeking contemporary expression. Her discussions about balancing innovation with respect for historical techniques influenced my approach to adapting classic pastry methods for modern presentations, while maintaining their essential character and integrity. By the end of my third day at Villa Emerald, I was creating desserts that surprised me with their sophistication and artistic merit. Chef Roussillon had pushed me through fundamental techniques quickly, recognizing that my previous cooking experience and intellectual approach allowed for accelerated learning. We moved beyond basic procedures to complex presentations that required both technical skill and creative vision. The physical demands were considerable, requiring hours of standing, precise hand movements, and sustained concentration that left me exhausted but exhilarated each evening. I was using muscles and skills I'd never developed, discovering capabilities I hadn't known I possessed. Most importantly, I was creating work I was genuinely proud of. Desserts that met professional standards, rather than amateur attempts that merely satisfied family preferences. My confidence was growing not just in pastry techniques, but in my general ability to master new skills and rise to demanding challenges. The intensity of the program was proving that I could sustain professional-level effort and produce work that met expert standards. I wasn't just learning to make better desserts. I was discovering that I was capable of excellence in areas I'd never explored. The showcase dinner was planned for my final evening, and preparations were as elaborate as any professional event I could imagine. Each participant would present their work to an audience that included renowned chefs, celebrated artists, cultural critics, and influential figures from the international community that made the French Riviera their home. This wasn't a friendly family gathering, but a serious artistic presentation where our work would be evaluated by experts in their respective fields. Chef Roussillon and I planned my dessert presentation with the care and attention typically reserved for Michelin-starred restaurant debuts. We designed a multi-course progression that would showcase different techniques I'd mastered, from delicate sugar work to complex flavor layering, to innovative plating methods that transform traditional desserts into contemporary artistic statements. The menu I would present included a deconstructed tarte tatin featuring caramelized pears in 5 different preparations, a chocolate soufflé with lavender ice cream and honeycomb tuile, and a finale of individual croquembouche towers with sponge sugar sculptures that would be assembled tableside. Each element required techniques I'd learned during my intensive week, and the overall presentation would demonstrate both technical mastery and creative vision. The days leading up to the showcase were filled with practice sessions that pushed me to my physical and creative limits. Chef Roussillon demanded perfection in every element, requiring multiple repetitions until each technique became automatic and each presentation flawless. I worked longer hours than I had in decades, driven by excitement and determination rather than obligation or external pressure. My family had been following my progress through photos and video calls that documented my intensive training and growing expertise. Their initial surprise at the advanced nature of my studies had evolved into genuine admiration for the sophisticated work I was producing. Rebecca asked detailed questions about techniques I was learning, clearly impressed by the professional level of my instruction and the complexity of my projects. Marcus expressed amazement at my stamina and dedication, recognizing that my schedule was more demanding than many professional commitments he'd undertaken. He seemed particularly impressed by my willingness to accept criticism and push through frustration when techniques didn't come easily, qualities he admitted he sometimes struggled with in his own challenging situations. Patricia was fascinated by the creative aspects of my work, asking for detailed descriptions of my design process and artistic decisions. She recognized that I was engaging with creativity at a level she'd rarely achieved in her own artistic pursuits, approaching my dessert presentations with the kind of seriousness and sustained effort she'd often avoided in favor of moving to new projects when difficulties arose. Their changing perception of my capabilities was gratifying, but more importantly, I was discovering aspects of myself I'd never known existed. The combination of physical challenge, creative expression, and intellectual engagement was fulfilling me in ways I'd never experienced. I was operating at full capacity for the first time in my adult life, using abilities I'd developed over decades in service of personal goals rather than family obligations. The evening of the showcase dinner arrived with perfect Mediterranean weather, warm breezes carrying the scent of jasmine and lavender through the villa's open windows. The dining room had been transformed into an elegant gallery space where each participant's work would be displayed and evaluated by our distinguished guests. Professional lighting highlighted our presentations, and expert service staff ensured that everything would be executed flawlessly. Our guests arrived fashionably late, as was customary in this sophisticated international community. I recognized several faces from magazines and cultural publications, people whose opinions carried weight in artistic and culinary circles far beyond the French Riviera. The conversation was conducted in multiple languages, with effortless transitions between English, French, Italian, and German that reflected the cosmopolitan nature of our audience. Professor Yamamoto presented his culinary research first, offering a tasting menu that demonstrated his mastery of traditional French techniques while incorporating subtle Japanese influences that enhanced rather than overwhelmed classic preparations. His presentation was scholarly but passionate, explaining historical context while allowing guests to experience the evolution of techniques through carefully sequenced tastings. Maestro Weber's perfume presentation was a sensory journey that engaged guests in understanding fragrance composition through guided olfactory experiences. He'd created signature scents for each guest based on brief consultations, demonstrating his mastery of traditional perfume making while showcasing his musicians' understanding of how different notes could be orchestrated into harmonious compositions. Dr. Hamilton's sculpture exhibition featured pieces that bridged historical techniques with contemporary expression, each work accompanied by detailed explanations of methods she'd mastered and artistic choices she'd made. Her pieces were substantial accomplishments that would have been impressive from any artist, regardless of when in their career they'd been created. When my turn arrived, I felt calm confidence rather than nervous anxiety. Chef Roussillon introduced me with praise that acknowledged both my rapid mastery of demanding techniques and the artistic merit of my presentations. I began with the deconstructed tarte tatin, explaining how traditional elements had been reimagined while preserving essential flavors and textures that honored the classic dessert's heritage. The chocolate soufflé with lavender ice cream required tableside preparation that demonstrated technical skills I'd mastered during my intensive training. I worked efficiently and confidently, explaining techniques while executing complex procedures that resulted in perfect texture and temperature combinations. The assembled presentation was both visually stunning and deliciously sophisticated. My finale, the individual croquembouche towers with spun sugar sculptures, provided dramatic visual impact while showcasing the most advanced techniques I'd learned. I assembled each tower tableside, creating spun sugar decorations that transformed familiar pastry elements into contemporary art pieces. The technical execution was flawless, and the artistic result exceeded even my own expectations. The response from our expert audience was immediate and enthusiastic. Several guests approached me afterward to discuss specific techniques and ask about my culinary background, clearly impressed by both the sophistication of my work and the rapid pace of my learning. A food critic from a prestigious French culinary magazine asked for my contact information, expressing interest in featuring my story in an upcoming article about accomplished older students pursuing serious culinary education. Chef Roussillon's evaluation was the highest praise I could have received. He acknowledged that I'd not only mastered the techniques he'd taught, but had demonstrated the kind of intuitive understanding and creative application that separated serious practitioners from casual students. He suggested that I consider pursuing advanced certification programs, treating my culinary development as an ongoing journey rather than a vacation accomplishment. The evening concluded with champagne on the villa's terrace, overlooking the Mediterranean under a canopy of stars. I stood among accomplished individuals from around the world, receiving congratulations and engaging in sophisticated conversations about art, culture, and personal achievement. I belonged in this company not because of my age or background, but because of work I'd completed and skills I'd demonstrated. Alexandra approached me as the evening wound down, expressing satisfaction with my success, but also presenting an unexpected opportunity. She'd been so impressed with my progress and the positive response to my work that she wanted to offer me a position as a featured participant in future programs. I would have the opportunity to continue advanced training while helping to mentor other participants who were beginning their own intensive learning journeys. The offer represented a complete transformation of how I might spend my time and energy in the years ahead. Instead of returning to my role as family financial supporter and occasional traveler, I could become part of an international community of accomplished individuals who prioritized learning, growth, and artistic achievement throughout their lives. I didn't commit to Alexandra's offer immediately, but I promised to consider it seriously as I completed my European adventure. The possibility of ongoing involvement with demanding creative projects and sophisticated international communities was appealing in ways I was still processing. I discovered capabilities and interests I'd never known I possessed, and the idea of continuing to develop them was tremendously exciting. My phone buzzed with messages from my family, who'd been eagerly awaiting updates about the showcase dinner. I sent photos of my dessert presentations and brief descriptions of the evening's success, but I knew that the full impact of what I'd accomplished would be difficult to convey through text messages and images. Rebecca's response was immediate and effusive, expressing amazement at the professional quality of my work and the sophisticated nature of the event. She asked detailed questions about my training and the other participants, clearly recognizing that I'd been involved in something far more significant than typical vacation activities. Marcus called while I was still on the terrace, wanting to hear directly about my experiences and achievements. His enthusiasm was genuine and infectious, and he expressed pride in my accomplishments that felt different from the patronizing approval I'd sometimes received for smaller achievements. He was recognizing me as someone who'd succeeded in a demanding professional context, rather than simply praising me for trying something new. Patricia's response revealed how much my journey had influenced her own thinking about personal challenges and creative development. She mentioned that she'd been inspired by my willingness to pursue demanding training to enroll in serious art classes and commit to sustained projects rather than jumping between casual hobbies. My example was encouraging her to approach her own creativity with greater discipline and ambition. As I prepared for bed in my elegant suite overlooking the Mediterranean, I reflected on how completely my life had changed during these weeks of European travel. I'd begun this journey hoping to prove that I was capable of independent adventure, but I discovered that I was capable of far more than I'd ever imagined. The person who'd been dismissed as too frail for family vacation had just completed an intensive artistic residency that earned praise from professional experts and invitations to continue advanced training. I'd proven my capabilities not just to my family, but to a demanding international community that valued excellence and serious commitment to personal growth. More importantly, I discovered a version of myself I'd never known existed, someone who thrived under pressure, excelled in competitive situations, and found deep satisfaction in mastering complex skills. The dutiful mother and family supporter was still part of who I was, but she was no longer the complete definition of my identity or potential. My European adventure was drawing to a close, but I was beginning to understand that it represented the beginning rather than the culmination of a new phase in my life. I had decisions to make about how to use the capabilities I'd discovered and the opportunities I'd been offered, choices that would determine whether these weeks of growth would become a brief interlude or the foundation for a completely transformed future. The final morning at Villa Emerald brought a farewell breakfast with my fellow participants, each of us reflecting on how the intensive week had challenged and changed us. We exchanged contact information and made tentative plans for future meetings, recognizing that we'd formed bonds based on shared commitment to excellence and personal growth that transcended typical travel acquaintanceships. Alexandra provided detailed materials about future programs and opportunities, encouraging me to stay connected with the community of accomplished individuals she'd introduced me to during my stay. The network of contacts and continuing education possibilities she offered represented a completely different approach to how I might spend my time and energy in the years ahead. As my driver loaded my luggage for the journey to Nice airport, I took one final look at the Mediterranean vista that had provided the backdrop for such transformative experiences. I was leaving France as a different person than I'd been when I arrived, carrying new skills, expanded confidence, and opportunities that would allow me to continue growing and challenging myself indefinitely. The flight back to Los Angeles gave me hours to process everything that had happened during my European adventure, and to consider how these experiences would influence my future decisions. I was returning home with more than memories and souvenirs. I was bringing back a completely transformed understanding of my own capabilities and potential. But I was also returning to family relationships and living situations that had been based on assumptions about my limitations and roles that no longer reflected reality. The person who'd been considered too frail for European travel had just completed adventures that exceeded anything my family had imagined possible, and I would need to decide how to integrate these discoveries into my ongoing life. As the plane descended toward LAX, I felt excitement rather than apprehension about the conversations and decisions that lay ahead. I'd proven to myself that I was capable of far more than anyone had believed, and I was eager to explore how these newfound capabilities might reshape not just my own future but my relationships with the family members who'd underestimated me so completely. The moment I stepped through the door of my Malibu home after 6 weeks in Europe, the silence felt different. Where once the quiet had represented my invisibility within my own family, now it felt like space for possibilities I'd never considered. My luggage was filled with more than souvenirs and gifts. There were professional culinary tools from Chef Roussillon, contact information from accomplished individuals across 3 countries, and signed contracts for future artistic residency programs that would take me far beyond anything my family had ever imagined. Marcus was the first to arrive, appearing at my door within an hour of my return with what he claimed was casual interest in my travel experiences. But I could see something different in his approach, the cautious respect he might show someone whose capabilities he was still trying to understand. He helped me carry luggage inside while asking questions about my journey that revealed he'd been thinking seriously about our phone conversations from Europe. As I unpacked items from my various adventures, Marcus examined each piece with genuine curiosity rather than polite interest. The specialized pastry tools Chef Roussillon had given me prompted detailed questions about techniques I'd learned and skills I'd mastered. The artistic supplies from my sculpture exploration with Dr. Hamilton led to conversations about creativity and craftsmanship that we'd never had before. When I showed him photos from the showcase dinner at Villa Emerald, Marcus studied them with the kind of attention he typically reserved for business documents or financial statements. He asked about the other participants, the expert audience, and the professional nature of my presentations with what seemed like growing understanding that I'd been involved in something far more significant than vacation activities. Rebecca arrived that evening with Derek and the teenagers, ostensibly for a welcome home dinner, but really to assess how my European adventures might have changed me. They brought takeout from an expensive restaurant, probably expecting that I'd be too tired from travel to cook, and were surprised when I suggested preparing something myself using techniques I'd learned during my culinary training. I prepared a relatively simple meal by the standards I'd recently achieved, but one that demonstrated skills and sophistication my family had never seen from me before. The precision of my knife work, the complexity of my sauce preparations, and the professional presentation of familiar ingredients created dishes that impressed them far more than expensive restaurant food ever had. During dinner, I shared selected stories from my travels, focusing initially on experiences that would seem familiar and non-threatening to their assumptions about appropriate activities for someone my age. I described beautiful scenery, comfortable accommodations, and cultural tours that sounded like enhanced versions of typical vacation experiences. But as the evening progressed and their comfort level increased, I began sharing details about the more demanding aspects of my adventures, the intensive training programs, the physical challenges I'd conquered, and the professional recognition I'd received from expert practitioners in multiple fields. Their expressions shifted from polite interest to genuine surprise as they began to understand the scope and sophistication of what I'd accomplished. Madison, my 17-year-old granddaughter, was the first to ask direct questions about my experiences that revealed she was processing information very differently than the adults. She wanted to know about the courage required to join programs where I didn't know anyone, the confidence needed to attempt skills I'd never tried before, and the satisfaction that came from succeeding in demanding situations. Her questions led to a conversation about taking risks and pushing beyond comfortable limitations that resonated with her teenage struggles to define herself independently from family expectations. I found myself sharing insights about personal growth and self-discovery that applied to her stage of life as much as mine, creating a connection between us that had never existed before. Kyle, my 15-year-old grandson, was fascinated by the physical aspects of my adventures, particularly the hiking and outdoor challenges that had been part of my Swiss experience. He'd apparently assumed that people my age were naturally limited in their physical capabilities, and my descriptions of mountain trails and demanding activities were reshaping his understanding of what aging meant. Derek's response was the most revealing, showing how my successful independent travel had challenged his assumptions about my financial judgment and decision-making capabilities. He'd clearly expected to hear stories about expensive mistakes, poor planning, or situations where my age had created problems. Instead, I was describing professionally managed experiences, sophisticated cultural engagement, and opportunities that had exceeded my own ambitious expectations. When I mentioned Alexandra's offer to become a featured participant in future programs, Derek's business-oriented mind immediately began calculating the implications. He asked detailed questions about the financial arrangements, the time commitments, and the professional development opportunities that revealed he was taking these possibilities seriously rather than dismissing them as retirement fantasies. Rebecca's reaction was more complex, combining pride in my achievements with concern about how these new interests might affect my availability for family support. She asked questions about future travel plans that seemed designed to assess whether my European adventures represented a temporary deviation from normal routine or a permanent shift in my priorities and lifestyle. I answered her questions honestly, explaining that I was considering several opportunities that would involve extended travel and intensive learning programs. I didn't mention that these opportunities would necessarily reduce my availability for funding family emergencies or providing free childcare. But I could see her beginning to calculate those implications. Patricia arrived later that evening, having delayed her visit to prepare what she clearly intended as a serious conversation about my experiences. She'd researched the programs I'd participated in, looked up the instructors I'd worked with, and prepared questions that revealed she understood the professional caliber of training I'd received. Her approach was different from the others, focusing on the creative and personal development aspects of my journey, rather than the practical or financial implications. She wanted to understand how I'd found the courage to attempt such demanding challenges, how I'd overcome intimidation about working with expert practitioners, and how I'd maintained motivation when techniques didn't come easily. Our conversation revealed that my experiences had inspired Patricia to reconsider her own approach to creative development. She'd enrolled in serious art classes, committed to sustained projects, and was approaching her artistic interests with the kind of discipline and long-term thinking she'd previously avoided. My example had encouraged her to pursue excellence, rather than simply exploring new hobbies. When Patricia asked about my future plans, I shared more details about the opportunities Alexandra had presented, including the possibility of ongoing involvement with international artistic communities and continued advanced training in various creative fields. Patricia's response was immediately enthusiastic, recognizing these opportunities as the kind of serious artistic engagement she'd always claimed to want for herself. The family gathering extended far beyond the quick welcome-home dinner they'd originally planned, evolving into a late-evening conversation that covered topics we'd never discussed before. For the first time in our adult relationships, they were asking for my perspectives on risk-taking, personal growth, and the pursuit of excellence, rather than simply updating me on their own challenges and needs. Marcus mentioned that he'd been researching solo travel options for himself, inspired by my courage in pursuing international adventures independently. He asked for practical advice about planning and preparation, treating me as someone with valuable expertise rather than someone who'd gotten lucky with vacation planning. Rebecca admitted that my culinary achievements had made her reconsider her own relationship with cooking and creativity. She'd been inspired to sign up for advanced cooking classes and was approaching food preparation with the kind of seriousness and attention to technique she'd never brought to domestic activities. Even Derek acknowledged that my successful management of complex international travel and expensive programs had impressed him with my practical capabilities and financial judgment. He asked questions about my decision-making process that revealed he was taking my business acumen seriously for the first time in our relationship. As the evening concluded and my family prepared to return to their respective homes, I sensed that something fundamental had shifted in our relationships. They were no longer seeing me primarily as their mother and financial supporter, but as an accomplished individual whose experiences and insights had value independent of my role in their lives. The next morning brought the first test of how these changed perceptions would translate into modified expectations about my ongoing availability and priorities. Rebecca called early, asking if I could provide emergency childcare because her regular sitter had canceled. In the past, such requests had been automatic assumptions about my availability and willingness to accommodate family needs. This time, I explained that I had important commitments related to my culinary development, including a consultation call with Chef Roussillon about advanced training opportunities and research time for planning future travel programs. Rebecca's initial surprise at my refusal quickly shifted to understanding as she processed that I now had professional obligations that competed with family convenience. When she asked when I might be available instead, I suggested several alternative times while explaining that my schedule was increasingly filled with activities related to my ongoing education and creative development. This wasn't a rejection of family involvement, but a recognition that my time and energy were no longer automatically available for any family need that arose. Marcus stopped by that afternoon with what he presented as interest in seeing more photos from my travels, but I suspected he wanted to continue processing how my achievements might influence his own life decisions. We spent hours reviewing materials from my various programs, and he asked detailed questions about the confidence-building aspects of my experiences. Our conversation revealed that Marcus had been struggling with self-doubt and fear of failure that had limited his willingness to pursue opportunities or take necessary risks. My example of succeeding in demanding situations where I'd had no prior experience was encouraging him to reconsider his own assumptions about his capabilities and potential. When Marcus asked about my decision-making process for choosing which opportunities to pursue, I found myself sharing insights about risk assessment, goal setting, and personal growth that applied directly to his current career and relationship challenges. For the first time in our adult relationship, he was seeking my guidance about life strategy rather than financial support. Patricia visited that evening with materials from her new art classes, wanting to show me work she'd created using approaches inspired by my European experiences. Her pieces demonstrated a level of sustained effort and technical development I'd never seen from her before, suggesting that my example had influenced her to pursue excellence rather than simply experimenting with new activities. She asked for feedback on her artistic progress with the kind of seriousness usually reserved for professional critiques, treating me as someone qualified to evaluate creative work rather than simply a supportive family member. I was able to provide useful observations based on techniques I'd learned and standards I'd experienced during my intensive training programs. Our conversation about artistic development led to broader discussions about career planning and professional growth that revealed Patricia was considering more structured approaches to her creative interests. She was researching galleries, exhibition opportunities, and advanced training programs with the goal of developing a serious artistic practice rather than maintaining creative hobbies. The most significant change in family dynamics became apparent during our next family dinner, when conversations naturally centered around my European experiences and future plans, rather than updates about their various challenges and needs. They asked detailed questions about opportunities I was considering, offered thoughtful observations about my artistic development, and sought my perspectives on topics ranging from travel planning to risk assessment. Rebecca mentioned that she'd been reconsidering her own career trajectory, inspired by my willingness to pursue demanding challenges in completely new fields. She was researching advanced marketing programs and considering opportunities that would require her to stretch beyond her comfort zone in ways she'd previously avoided. Derek admitted that my successful management of complex European logistics had impressed him with capabilities he'd never recognized, leading him to reconsider his assumptions about effective planning and decision-making. He asked for my input on business strategies he was developing, treating my insights as valuable rather than simply being polite about family involvement. The teenagers were particularly responsive to stories about my learning experiences, asking questions about overcoming intimidation and building confidence that revealed they were processing information they could apply to their own challenges. Madison mentioned that my example had encouraged her to pursue more demanding academic opportunities, while Kyle was considering physical challenges he'd previously avoided. When I announced that I'd accepted Alexandra's invitation to participate in an advanced program in Morocco the following month, their responses revealed how completely their attitudes had changed. Instead of expressing concern about my safety or capabilities, they asked excited questions about the cultural experiences I'd encounter and the skills I'd be developing. Rebecca immediately began researching Moroccan culture and cuisine, expressing interest in learning about techniques I'd be studying and ingredients I'd be working with. Marcus asked about the physical demands of the program with admiration rather than concern, recognizing that I'd demonstrated my ability to handle challenging conditions successfully. Patricia was particularly intrigued by the artistic aspects of Moroccan crafts I'd be exploring, asking detailed questions about traditional techniques and contemporary applications that revealed she was thinking about these opportunities as serious educational experiences rather than vacation activities. Even Derek expressed interest in the business and logistics aspects of international program management, asking questions about planning and coordination that revealed he was impressed by the complexity of arrangements I was managing independently. The weeks leading up to my departure for Morocco were filled with family interactions that reflected these transformed relationships. Instead of checking on my welfare or expressing concerns about my plans, they sought my advice about their own challenges and shared their excitement about my continuing adventures. Rebecca asked for culinary advice as she pursued her own cooking education, treating me as someone with valuable expertise, rather than simply a family member with home cooking experience. She was implementing techniques I'd taught her and approaching food preparation with the kind of attention to excellence she'd learned from observing my European experiences. Marcus sought my guidance about travel planning as he prepared for his own solo adventure, recognizing that I'd developed expertise in areas where he lacked experience. He was applying risk assessment and decision-making approaches I'd shared, treating my insights as valuable business intelligence rather than maternal advice. Patricia included me in serious discussions about her artistic development, asking for feedback on work she was creating and input about opportunities she was considering. She was approaching her creative practice with sustained effort and long-term thinking that reflected influence from my example of pursuing excellence through disciplined study. The most satisfying change was in how they spoke about me to others. I overheard Rebecca describing my European achievements to friends with obvious pride, highlighting the professional level of training I'd received and the recognition I'd earned from expert practitioners. Her description focused on my accomplishments rather than her surprise that someone my age could achieve such things. Marcus mentioned my adventures to business colleagues in ways that demonstrated he viewed my experiences as impressive professional development rather than amusing retirement activities. He was clearly proud of my achievements and confident that his associates would be impressed by the scope and sophistication of my educational pursuits. Patricia shared my story with fellow artists in terms that emphasized the serious nature of my training and the quality of work I was producing. She was treating my artistic development as inspiration for her own creative community, rather than simply an interesting family anecdote. When Derek mentioned my experiences to his business contacts, he focused on the strategic planning and risk management aspects of my international programs, clearly viewing my decision-making as sophisticated rather than lucky. He was presenting my achievements as evidence of capabilities that commanded professional respect. The evening before my departure for Morocco, my family gathered for what had become a tradition of farewell dinners that celebrated my upcoming adventures, rather than expressing concern about my safety. They brought thoughtful gifts related to my studies, asked informed questions about my itinerary, and shared their excitement about the experiences I'd encounter. Rebecca presented me with a professional quality notebook specifically designed for culinary research, along with specialized pens that would work in various climates and conditions. She'd clearly researched the practical needs of serious culinary students rather than simply choosing a generic travel gift. Marcus gave me a high-end camera designed for adventure travel, complete with protective equipment and extra storage for documenting experiences in demanding conditions. His gift reflected understanding that I'd be pursuing challenging activities rather than simply sightseeing in comfortable circumstances. Patricia had created a custom travel portfolio for organizing materials from my various programs, designed to accommodate the certificates, recipes, and artistic supplies I'd be collecting during my educational pursuits. Her gift demonstrated appreciation for the serious nature of my studies and the value of preserving documentation from my experiences. Derek surprised me with a comprehensive travel insurance policy that covered not just medical emergencies but protection for educational materials, equipment, and program fees. His gift reflected recognition that my travels involved significant investments in my ongoing development rather than simple vacation expenses, The teenagers contributed a collaborative gift, a detailed travel journal they'd designed specifically for documenting learning experiences, with sections for different types of skills, spaces for photos and sketches, and prompts for reflection that revealed they understood the educational nature of my adventures. Their gifts were thoughtful and practical, reflecting genuine understanding of my interests and activities, rather than assumptions about appropriate presents for elderly family members. They were supporting my continuing education rather than humoring retirement hobbies, treating my pursuits as serious endeavors worthy of professional quality tools and resources. As we shared dinner that evening, conversation naturally focused on my upcoming Moroccan adventure and the skills I'd be developing, rather than concerns about my welfare or capabilities. They asked informed questions about traditional crafts I'd be studying, cooking techniques I'd be learning, and cultural experiences I'd encounter with obvious interest in my educational progress. Rebecca mentioned that she'd been following several Moroccan chefs on social media, researching techniques and ingredients so she could better understand my studies and potentially learn from my experiences. She was treating my culinary education as a resource for her own development, rather than simply a topic of conversation. Marcus shared articles he'd found about Moroccan business culture and modern economic development, providing context for understanding the country I'd be visiting beyond tourist attractions. He was engaging with my travels as opportunities for cultural learning rather than simply adventures to be survived safely. Patricia had researched traditional Moroccan arts and contemporary artistic movements, preparing to discuss my creative experiences with informed interest rather than polite questions. She was viewing my artistic education as inspiration for her own creative development, rather than entertainment for family updates. When Derek asked about my long-term plans for continuing education and international programs, his questions revealed that he was thinking strategically about my ongoing development rather than simply managing immediate concerns. He was treating my educational pursuits as serious career planning, rather than retirement activities to be accommodated temporarily. As the evening concluded and I prepared for final packing, my family's support felt qualitatively different from their previous well-wishes. They were celebrating my achievements and anticipating my continued growth rather than hoping I'd stay safe during unusual activities. They were proud of my accomplishments and confident in my abilities, rather than surprised by my success despite my age. The morning of my departure brought final conversations that emphasized excitement about my upcoming experiences rather than concerns about my welfare. Rebecca called with last-minute culinary questions she wanted me to research, treating me as a valuable source of information rather than someone who needed checking on before travel. Marcus stopped by with articles about Moroccan architecture and engineering he thought might interest me, demonstrating that he was thinking about my intellectual engagement with new cultures, rather than simply my physical safety during international travel. His support was focused on enhancing my experiences rather than minimizing potential risks. Patricia sent photos of her latest artistic work, asking me to look for Moroccan influences and techniques that might inform her ongoing creative development. She was viewing my travels as resources for her own artistic growth, rather than activities to be followed with friendly interest. As my driver arrived to take me to the airport, my family gathered to see me off with the same enthusiasm they'd previously reserved for their own adventures. They were genuinely excited about my upcoming experiences and confident in my ability to maximize the educational opportunities I'd encounter. Their farewell gifts included practical items for my studies, professional quality notebooks, specialized equipment for various crafts, and communication tools for staying connected with my ongoing educational community. They were supporting my learning rather than simply hoping for my safe return, treating my travels as investments in my continuing development. The transformation in our relationships was complete and permanent. I was no longer the family member whose primary value lay in financial support and domestic availability, but an accomplished individual whose experiences and insights enriched our entire family dynamic. They were proud of my achievements, inspired by my courage, and supportive of my continuing growth in ways that honored my independence while maintaining our emotional connections. As I settled into my first-class seat for the flight to Morocco, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since that family meeting where they'd announced their European vacation without including me. The person they'd considered too frail for their adventure was now embarking on her fourth international educational program, with a waiting list of opportunities that would continue challenging and developing her capabilities for years to come. My phone buzzed with final messages from my family, each expressing excitement about my upcoming experiences and confidence in my continued success. Rebecca asked me to send updates about cooking techniques. Marcus requested photos of architectural details that might inform his own travel planning, and Patricia wanted sketches of artistic elements she could incorporate into her own creative work. Their requests revealed that they now viewed my experiences as valuable resources for their own development, rather than activities to be monitored for safety concerns. They were learning from my example and applying insights from my adventures to their own pursuits, creating a family dynamic based on mutual inspiration rather than one-way support. As the plane lifted off toward Morocco and my next educational adventure, I smiled thinking about how wrong they'd been about my frailty and limitations. But more importantly, I was grateful for how right I'd been about my own potential for growth, learning, and adventure that would continue expanding my capabilities and enriching my life for many years to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.